All right. So big topic today, guys, caffeine. I don't know how many of you are caffeine consumers via coffee, tea, etc. I loved this picture. I thought it was like the guy with his espresso and probably the guy without. No guarantees though. All right, what we're going to cover today, what caffeine is and how does it work, some of the benefits and disadvantages, potential disadvantages of caffeine, how to use it, some of the different sources that you are probably consuming it in, and maybe ones you want to think about for your racing, some common questions that Scott and I have seen about caffeine, and then we'll open it up to Q&A at the end. As always, if you have questions while we're going along or want to chime in or have personal stories about caffeine, feel free to jump in. All right, so what is caffeine? Scientist in me likes to have the chemical formula there on the side. In this context, for our discussion today, it's an ergogenic aid. So as recently, I think it was 2004, that WADA actually took it off of the banned substances list. So in terms of how powerful of a performance enhancer it can be, as recently as 2004, and now it's on they still test for it, like the maybe list. So they can potentially, they look for it and can decide if you are abusing caffeine, like if they see really high peaks, they have reserved that ability to potentially fine you or take away a title. So it's definitely a performance enhancing compound, and something that, while it's been widely studied, is definitely, I would say, on the list of controversial in terms of exactly how it works, who it works for, how long it takes to work, how much you need to work. So we know that it works. It's just a matter of, there's a wide range in terms of who it works for, how, when, and why. Specifically, when we're looking at caffeine and adenosine look very much the same chemically. And so caffeine will go in and bind to those adenosine receptors. Adenosine is the compound in your body that will make you feel tired or drowsy. And so caffeine goes in there, and kind of imagine two puzzle pieces connecting. Caffeine goes in there and like fills that spot and can help keep you awake, create that artificial state of alertness. It also can trigger the release of adrenaline and epinephrine, which gives you that boost, that energy, that spike in kind of, which we talk about, motivation, movement, craving, drive, via increasing the sensitivity of dopamine receptors. So it's very much a neuromodulator. We see other potential benefits. Caffeine can affect our muscles. It can cause excretion of sodium via way of the kidney. We'll talk about dehydration coming up. So in terms of what it does, what caffeine is in the body, it is a neurotransmitter, neuromodulator that affects drowsiness, motivation. And then specifically when it comes to performance, we're going to talk about some of those benefits coming up.
Elizabeth, just one thing, and I don't know if this is current, but my understanding was in the NCAA is that it's a banned substance, just for people who may have children competing in university. So yeah, my understanding is that it's the equivalent of 15 micrograms per milliliter, which is nearly the equivalent of around 500 milligrams of caffeine. And that is actually banned under the NCAA. So it is just something to consider. Probably not applicable to most of our athletes, but could be applicable to children and teenagers. So
that I did not know.
I'm sure that's up to date, but I will check that. That was what I read recently, which I thought was quite surprising.
Yeah, especially since WADA doesn't. And granted, I was in NC2A sports a long time ago, but I know it wasn't banned or maybe it, actually, I don't even know.
It probably was, but they probably don't test.
Probably was, but they didn't test for it, or didn't care to test us for it. Either way.
Exactly. But just something to keep in mind.
No, absolutely important. All right, so some of the benefits and drawbacks. Benefits that we've seen: improved endurance, performance, mood, and motivation, reducing that perception of pain and fatigue, and then in some moderate to high doses, increasing that intestinal absorption of carbohydrate during exercise. So when you're looking at benefits, does it potentially could make the work seem easier, potentially help with focus, potentially help with focus. Oh my gosh, I don't know why that, sorry. Switch this.
Just while Elizabeth's doing that, so just on those points as well. So time to exhaustion has been shown to be improved. Time trial time trials have also been shown to be improved through a high bolus of caffeine. And we'll get into probably the dosages around what they are. Is everything all right, Eve?
I don't know what's going on there. I'll fix it here in a second.
Okay. So yeah, in terms of the RPE, in terms of rate of perceived exertion, that's one of the clear benefits of caffeine ingestion during exercise, is that the perceived effort of whatever you're doing becomes effectively easier for the athlete as a result of caffeine ingestion.
Thank you. And then some of the potential drawbacks: increased anxiety, poor sleep quality, and then, as I spoke to earlier, a very high variability of effectiveness. I think when Scott and I are talking about supplements, you always want to look at, is the benefit of taking this worthwhile? And as I'll get into later, the importance of actually doing the testing yourself and figuring out, N=1 when it comes to caffeine. If it increases anxiety, if your sleep, if it negatively impacts your sleep, the benefit of getting good sleep is greater day over day over day, and especially before performance, than potentially the benefit that you're going to get from caffeine. So if you are someone that either you don't know if caffeine affects you, or you've noticed it does increase anxiety or increase heartbeat or result in poor sleep quality or cause, some people get gastric, GI distress, the benefit of taking it does not outweigh the drawback. So always, when you're choosing any supplement, be mindful of, just because other people are taking it or just because it lists a potential benefit, it might not be the right benefit for you. So as we'll get into later, the importance of testing before race day, because there are so many variables when it comes to caffeine.
Yeah, and just on that, in terms of the drawbacks, in terms of things like poor sleep quality, there are ways of mitigating that. Again, like the timing of ingestion of caffeine is certainly important in terms of reducing the risk of it impacting your sleep, and that's going to relate to a number of factors, but mainly what the half-life of caffeine is, which, depending on your ability to metabolize the caffeine, could be somewhere between 4 and 8 hours. So you just want to keep that in mind. If it is something where you find drinking caffeine or ingesting caffeine does impact your sleep, you certainly want to just probably at least think of not taking caffeine after 12 o'clock in the afternoon. And that's a pretty sort of blanket rule that I tend to apply to, or try to apply to myself, but certainly try to provide that to athletes as well, to give them an understanding that, if you have, and caffeine in the source of coffee is a very poor source of caffeine, just as an FYI, because of the variability in caffeine content within a cup of coffee. So you could have a filter cup of coffee, which could contain 70 milligrams, but it could also contain 140 milligrams. And if you then take the half-life of that at 6 hours, you could have a full espresso in you still 6 or 7 hours later if you drank that at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. So, and I know Americans love their filter coffee. So it is something just to consider if you are consuming filter coffee a lot. Actually, there's a good story about that. If anyone likes Dave Grohl and enjoys the Foo Fighters or Nirvana, then I recommend his book, which is The Storyteller. And he talks about his caffeine addiction through filter coffee and actually ending up seeing a doctor because he thought he was going to have a heart attack. So
really,
it's an entertaining story, and it's a very good book. And if you like grunge music, then I'd certainly recommend you read The Storyteller. But it gives you a good insight into just how bad filter coffee and excessive caffeine consumption can be for your health.
So Scott, what kind, because I'm not a coffee drinker, what kind of coffee do you consume?
I'm actually drinking, I don't know if you can see that, but I'm drinking yerba mate at the moment, which has a fairly decent amount of caffeine, but it's a little bit, it seems to be slower in terms of the way it impacts me, whether that's placebo or not. I tend to drink espresso coffee out of a machine. Again, the variability in espresso shots can be somewhere between 60 and 100 milligrams of caffeine. And what I would, and this is something that we all tend to recommend, is if you are going to take caffeine as a diet, as an ergogenic aid in terms of performance, then utilize a supplement form of caffeine it's not feasible to drink coffee anyway whilst you're riding or running, but certainly pick a reputable brand, and then it's about choosing the appropriate dose, which we will touch on.
Great. I like yerba mate too, by the way. That's one of my teas of choice.
Although the drawback with yerba mate, and again, like if you read some of the longitudinal studies on it, that it could possibly increase the risk of carcinomas, and it could be carcinogenic because traditionally they smoke yerba mate. So if you are going to get yerba mate, it probably makes sense to get an unsmoked version.
But then how much are you consuming in a concentrated, like are you drinking it daily? Is it like, it's in my tea rotation?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at people who drink yerba mate, they tend to drink a lot of it as well. So in South America, and they're drinking sort of, 1 to 2 liters of the stuff a day. So again, context specific, look at what the research is showing about how much are they consuming and then go from there. But yeah, I mean, I probably drink 500 to maybe a liter, 500 mils to a liter of it if I am drinking it in a day, but I wouldn't drink it every day.
Yeah. Again, context matters.
Correct.
All right. So how and when to use caffeine? If you're looking at about the amount, that's supposed to say 3. I don't know. Oh, okay. 1.36 milligrams per pound of body weight, or 3 milligrams per kilogram of body weight. So 204 milligrams for a 150-pound athlete. When they're doing the studies, some of them like 3 to 6 milligrams per kilo of body weight is usually what they do. And they kind of count that 3 to 6 as a moderate to high dose. And then up to 9, they've done tests up to 9 that show after about 9 milligrams, you don't see a greater benefit. So more is not better over about 9 milligrams. And again, that's a lot of caffeine. So if and when we'll talk about this, about learning how to use it, don't start at 9 and work your way back. Start at 3 or about that 200 milligrams. And then you can test a little more, a little less, etc. So if you're looking at it in a gel or in a caffeine pill or gum or whatever, about 200 milligrams. And as we'll talk about in context, most gels don't have that much. So if you're looking for that caffeine stimulus and boost and you're expecting a result, the gel obviously isn't going to have enough. And you want to make sure that you get in that 200 milligram. You're not drip feeding caffeine throughout your race. Timing, as Scott said, the half-life is about 4 hours. Again, depending on how your body metabolizes caffeine, it could be up to 8, but the average is about 4 to 5. And that means that the caffeine is still in your system in some way. When you're looking at timing, are you taking it before starting your event? Are you taking it during your event? Are you using it as a pre-workout? Are you using it at the end of your bike for energy for the run or boost for the run? So it matters planning that timing ahead of time. And if you are one of those athletes that has your cup of coffee, let's say with your Ironman breakfast, you might be getting in, as Scott said, 60 to 100 milligrams of caffeine, maybe a little more. If that breakfast is at 4 a.m., it's likely still in your body at about 8 a.m., potentially longer. So look, just paying attention to timing, feeling the effects, knowing when that caffeine does give you that boost, and how much is needed. Let's see, other considerations. Does habitual caffeine consumption, does it affect tolerance to and sensitivity to? And then the other kinds of sources, coffee versus energy drinks versus pills, caffeine gum, gels, which are the best. So we're going to go into those a little bit. Scott, do you have anything you want to cover about amount or timing?
Yeah, I think just the amount, like, it's a lot of people often ask, why are we recommending, or why in particular I recommend 200 milligrams of caffeine as a bolus in a pill form versus 100 milligrams in a gel. So there have been some studies done on it. There's a good one that's referenced it was to do with cyclists in 2016. I think the person's name was Talanian, Talanian, I think it is, et al. And they just did a comparison of 200 milligrams versus 100 milligrams. And they actually said that 200 milligrams was only a moderate amount of caffeine. So it was put at roughly 3 milligrams per kilogram body weight. And that was considered a moderate dose. Just for everyone out there who always says to me, 200 milligrams, it's really high. It's actually not that high. If you consider 9 milligrams is potentially the upper limit, although I'm certainly not recommending anyone does 9 milligrams because it will blow your head off. But a 200 milligram bolus has been shown to be more effective in time trial performance than 100 milligrams. And so this comes back to, again, what Elizabeth was saying is a lot of the gels will contain only 25 milligrams of caffeine. So you would have to consume 4 of those gels in order to even get 100 milligrams. So they're pretty much ineffective, those gels with 25 milligrams of caffeine. We are now starting to see gels with 100 milligrams of caffeine in them. Now, if that is your preferred route, all it means is you've probably got to take those 2 100 milligram caffeinated gels in fairly quick succession. So roughly, within 15, 20 minutes, it may give you a similar effect to the 200 milligrams of caffeine bolus in a pill form. One of the athletes on the weekend running Santa Cruz did this. He used the 100 milligram caffeinated Morton gels just because he didn't want to fiddle around with a 200 milligram pill. He felt it worked really well. Now, again, this comes back to what Elizabeth's talking about in terms of N=1. Be your own sort of scientist, be the participant in your own scientific study and find what works for you. I know there's one person on this call who is very nervous about taking caffeine, and she did take some caffeine, and she can probably give her experience about how caffeine went this week. But again, it's work out what works for you. Now, in terms of what you can also do to minimize that sort of fiddling around with caffeine is something that I suggested to another athlete, which came as a result of what Lena Thames does, a professional Norwegian athlete. She just cuts a small slit in the top of her precision gels. She slides in a 200 milligram caffeine pill. She then tapes it up with a bit of red tape. It's very clear that that gel now contains 200 milligrams of caffeine. It dissolves in the gel. over time. She's practiced that. It works really well. So that's how she manages 200 milligrams in a single gel. That's her preference. So what I would encourage is work out how much caffeine you require in order to get that performance improvement without any of the detriments that can occur as a result of taking in too much caffeine as well. And Karen, would you like to just give your little experience of caffeine this week? Oh, you're on mute. You're on mute.
I haven't done the pill yet. It's sitting on my counter staring at me.
Oh, I thought you did it. Sorry.
No, but I did. So actually, I wrote down a question because what I did was on my long run, I did more of my gels were caffeinated than non. And usually I might, experiment with one on a long ride or two on a long ride periodically. But I think I had 6 of them that were caffeinated on that run.
And were they 25 milligrams each?
Well, they were, which for me was a big hit of caffeine. So I felt great on the run. I was wired for the rest of the day. But a question I have, Elizabeth, or Scott, maybe you said it, but you were talking about, take it all at once versus like, I don't know if you said drip feed the caffeine, but why not just keep a continual flow of caffeine going versus taking one giant shot?
This comes down again to the research again, like you look at the research and look at what they did. They provided 100 milligrams, 0 versus 100 versus 200 milligrams and saw an improvement in time trial performance. As far as I'm aware, I haven't seen studies where they've done drip feeding of the same amount of caffeine. So rather than giving 200 milligrams, if they gave 100 milligrams and then gave another 100 milligrams at another point in time, would that have the same effect? Don't know. I haven't seen that research. Maybe it exists. It's just pain in the bum, like to have to then take it again and again and again. If you just, take it in one, knowing that the half-life as well is so long. So again, depending on your genetic makeup in terms of your metabolism, like I'm a slow metabolizer. So, and that's through genetic testing. It's probably one of the only genetic tests I actually sort of think is of value, which certainly gave me value, is that I know I metabolize caffeine really slowly. So if I drink too much caffeine, it has really, if I consume too much caffeine, certainly in the form of coffee, it has very adverse effects on me once I get beyond 3 cups of coffee. Like I feel terrible. And I know that I can't sleep. So I have to really make sure I don't drink coffee too late in the day. Otherwise I can't. So it depends on knowing that the half-life of caffeine is somewhere between 4 and 6 hours. Why bother? You're still going to have it in your system, whether you take it as a bolus or drip feed it in. So I think it just works out how good that hit is for you. And, my experience with athletes is that they take that 200 milligrams of caffeine at a particular point in time, in a 70.3, probably around 40, 60 minutes in an Ironman. That's on the bike. On an Ironman, they might take it maybe, 30 to 60 minutes later. And it provides a significant boost to their energy levels, as what you felt just by taking in, your smaller doses of caffeine. You sort of could double or triple that sort of output. So, I think it all comes down to practicing in training and getting comfortable with it. You don't need to practice it a lot. Obviously, what I think Elizabeth's talking about here in terms of other considerations is habitual caffeine consumption will reduce the effectiveness of caffeine consumption in a race scenario. So for you who doesn't drink any coffee or consume caffeine on a daily basis, the impact of that caffeine supplement is going to be significant on you versus me taking 200 milligrams of caffeine on a bike. It will probably just feel really good. And I'll probably get some performance improvement, but maybe not as much relative to what you would get because you don't consume caffeine. And this comes back to, like, again, should you abstain from caffeine consumption for 7 to 10 days before a race? the evidence suggests yes, but then you've also got to weigh up how bad you're going to feel if you suddenly go from drinking 3 or 4 cups of coffee a day to 0. You're going to end up with migraines. You're going to end up being really irritable. You just might be an absolute like mess that entire week. And psychologically, is the benefit of that worth the potential slight improvement in caffeine performance in a race? And so I think that's an important consideration for anyone out there who does drink or consume caffeine on a daily basis and is thinking of removing it in order to improve the effectiveness in a race scenario. Just consider that as well.
And I think this is also where, when we're talking about the effectiveness in different people and looking at different studies, the fact that you were having the caffeine in your gel, did that boost in energy come because you were regularly consuming gels? Did it come from the caffeine? Was it a combination of both? Have you tested, gels before that didn't have caffeine at those exact intervals, but contained the same amount of maybe fructose to glucose or whatever? Like, there's so many variables that we don't always know where that potential benefit is coming from. And they've done some study that showed that just telling people they were given caffeine, so they were giving decaffeinated coffee or a coffee flavored water, those people thought they were getting a high dose of caffeine and their performance increased anyway. So is there a psychological kind of placebo effect of, if you think you're taking in caffeine, does that help as well? So again, that's an outlier study, but something to consider. Same thing with the habitual caffeine use. Some people, they did a study that showed that eliminating caffeine for 4 days gave them a small beneficial effect in a cycling performance time trial at the end of that 4 days. Some required 14 days and some required 21 days. So again, looking at the differences in different individuals, it's worthwhile to go before your race and maybe, a couple months before your race, stop caffeine for 4 days or 5 days, see how you feel, and then bring caffeine back and see how you feel. Don't just experiment race week. Yeah. I heard it was good for me to cut it out. Maybe I'll cut it out, right? So take that time beforehand to see if you experience negative effects, but 2, if you actually do experience a boost when you bring caffeine back in.
And then the only other thing I would say, just that bit about coffee, energy drinks, pills and gums and gels. What we do know is that pill form versus gum form, it will take longer for peak amounts of caffeine to hit the bloodstream in pill or capsule form versus gum. So with gum, you will have peak amounts of caffeine in a much shorter period of time. And that could be a consideration if you want to get a quick hit of caffeine in a race. Oh, okay, there we go. Sorry. So it is something what they've shown is that the peak amount there, somewhere between probably 80 and I think it's 40 to 80 minutes with the caffeinated gum versus with peak amounts for a pill form or a capsule form is somewhere like 80 minutes to 120 minutes before you hit peak caffeine.
Yeah.
But again, that's going to be variations on the individual as well.
Yeah. And so that's where planning out and trying different, like I'm an athlete that is more likely to be chewing gum than taking pills. Although I really love that, sticking it in the gel. That's a really great strategy. So like for me, gum would be a great option because I like chewing gum, and it's, might have that effect if, 10 to 15 minutes in, I might start to see the effect and then feel it, like Scott said, it's 60 to 80 minutes. And so as Scott touched on earlier, the differences in the amounts of caffeine that you could be consuming. I just like this table to show, and like homebrew drip coffee versus instant coffee, which some studies even show instant coffee as higher. Espresso, tea, for example, soft drinks, when you're drinking that Coke from the aid stations, are you potentially getting caffeine, small doses of caffeine from that, or Red Bull in the energy drinks? And this is a very low amount of caffeine for an energy drink. I had no idea, because I don't consume them, how much caffeine is in some of those energy drinks that we're giving to children. I can't believe it. Then energy bars or gels that might have caffeine in them. Excedrin, I think sometimes people don't realize that some of those over-the-counter medications can have it in, and then you see that caffeine tablet. If you are looking for an exact amount of caffeine, like Scott said, tablets and or gum, where it is very clear how much you're getting, because products that claim they have, pre-workouts are especially notorious for this, that say they contain 200 milligrams of caffeine, actually might not contain 200 milligrams of caffeine. They have other ingredients in them, taurine, beta-alanine, that companies are relying on to help give that boost or that energy feeling. So utilizing that might not give you the same effect. You might not be getting as much caffeine as you think you're getting.
Yeah, two points on that, actually. The pre-workouts, there was a really, I'd have to find the study, but it actually investigated the amount of caffeine in a lot of these pre-workouts, and some of them either contained zero, but some of them had up to triple to quadruple the amount of caffeine that was on the label. So again, choosing a reputable source of supplement is recommended. Most pre-workouts only work because they've got caffeine in them. The rest of the ingredients, like things like beta-alanine, is not a good pre-workout ingredient. It's actually better in terms of chronic consumption that will actually provide you, but it makes your face tingle, so everyone thinks it's a great pre-workout. The other thing to just keep in mind is, whilst there are ranges for differing amounts of caffeine here on this table, what's fascinating about, and this is why coffee is a very unreliable source of caffeine, is that you could grind the same batch of beans and have an espresso. They could measure the amount of caffeine in that shot of espresso. You then grind from the same amount of beans, have another shot of espresso, and assess the amount of caffeine in that espresso shot, and it will probably be completely different. So there's huge variations in caffeine amounts within the beans itself. So that is another reason why you're not relying on coffee as a good source of caffeine. And so, yeah, always choosing a reputable source of caffeine is advised.
All right. So when you are, I'd say my recommendation, if you take anything away from this, is to make a personalized plan and kind of constantly refine that. Realize that what works for other people might not work for you. Starting, if you start with 3 milligrams, the 6 milligrams work better, or 2 milligrams work better. Like, test different doses. Look at what happens if you split doses. Like, we were saying, what happens if you do well with, you might do better with 25, 25, 25. Look at if you take it 60 minutes before or 30 minutes before. Learn how fast you not just start to feel the effects, but then how long you feel those effects. Because that's going to tell you also where you want to put that in your race. If you're the type of person that metabolizes it very quickly, then you might want to have it earlier in the bike, and then again earlier or potentially very late in your run. If you're someone that it takes longer to metabolize, the window that you put that caffeine in might shift. What happens how do you feel, if you're always testing, if you're like, oh, I'll use coffee, as Scott and I have said, it's not reliable, or espresso, to test how much caffeine I'm getting, but then on race day you use pills or gum, that's not going to be very helpful. So use what you're going to be using in training and in racing. And then, like I said before, how do you feel if you eliminate caffeine 2, 4, 7, 14 days? See how your body responds. So running through all of these different scenarios to make up your personalized plan for utilizing caffeine. And then on top of that, if you're going to use a gel or a pill or gum, how are you going to carry that? How are you going to take it? Have you practiced that before? So it's not just good luck, take 200 milligrams of caffeine 60 minutes before and off you go. You have to take the time to test and figure out what works for you. All right, Scott, any other key points that we might want to look at before we open it up for some questions?
Are you going to touch on any of the genetics?
I'm glad you're here. I wanted you to touch on that.
So, look, and I'm not an expert in genetics by any way, but just so everyone understands, if you are going to get a genetics test done and they look at a SNP for your caffeine sensitivity, so they'll look at sensitivity and then they'll look at metabolism or tolerance. So they're looking at, in terms of your sensitivity, they're looking at whether you're a slow or fast sensitivity. So they look at these adenosine receptors and they'll look at your genotype, so the TT genotype, and that will either be given, if you're a TT genotype, you're a high sensitivity. If you're a C carrier, you're a low sensitivity. And again, it's probably, as much as anything, they'll explain it when they do the testing to you. As I said, I found this probably the only relevant genetic test I've ever had done that actually provided some insight. And then I think in terms of metabolism and tolerance, they look at what is called a P450 enzyme and then a CYP1A2 phenotype. And if you're an AA genotype, you're a fast metabolizer. If you're a C carrier, you're a slow metabolizer. I'm a slow metabolizer, and so that's how it affects me. I think what's really important is that there are equivocal results despite genetic variation. So I think, again, it comes down to the individual. I think it's all limited, yet it's very interesting. And I think there's going to be more work in this space. There seems to be lots of variation in the research around these genotypes and phenotypes, but certainly something of interest if you sort of want to get a little bit nerdy and see what your genetic makeup is and how you tolerate caffeine. And I think too, what it often points out is maybe what you already know about yourself. So for someone like Karen, for instance, she may go, well, I would put money on that I'm a C carrier and have slow metabolism and therefore am really sensitive to caffeine. And I guess it's in one of those cases, it's sort of like confirm, confirmation bias in that sense. So something to consider. If you're going to bother getting genetics testing done, then make sure it includes the caffeine one. But as I say, there is a lot of variability in the research as well. Yeah. Has anyone had it done, actually? Has anyone had their caffeine sensitivity done? Genetic testing? Has anyone done genetic testing on anything?
Nope.
Nope.
I haven't.
Yeah.
I posted this in the chat room, but are these tests offered through Inside Tracker?
I don't know if they do. I think they do genetic testing now, Inside Tracker, actually.
They do, but I don't know if they offer.
Caffeine sensitivity.
Yeah, I haven't heard it mentioned in any of our discussions, any of the meetings I've sat in on. So
okay.
I can tell you who I did mine. I can probably share mine.
I was going to say, I will find out and put it in the Facebook group. I'll get a definitive answer exactly on what their DNA testing looks at.
Awesome. Yeah, I'd be curious, even if there was something somewhere else to go in the States.
Yeah.
I'd be curious.
Give me 2 seconds. Oh yeah, keep talking and I did mine through DNA Fit. I'll see if I can bring it up and share it after this, once we finish.
Whilst not off topic, but really not on topic, since you said really the caffeine metabolizing, in your opinion, Scott, is one of the few actual worthwhile ones to test. Are there others that are just a complete waste of time, you think?
In terms of genetic testing? Yeah, I think most of them are a bit of a waste of time.
Yeah.
It's too early to say the value of it. Like when speaking to a lot of doctors and consultants and things like that, even dealing around, and we had who's the cardiologist out on?
It's been too
Sammy.
long.
Who is it? Jonathan?
Ambar.
Amber.
Amber, yeah. Like, you talk to cardiologists even around genetic testing of risk of heart disease and things like that. And it's just too early to say, like, it's not definitive. So I'd certainly, I would just say that, it's probably one of the sensitivities that one of the genetic testings you can get done. But they'll tend to lump them all in anyway. So, yeah. I can show you what it looks like from my perspective if you want. I'll show you later. I'll show it later. I can share it. Actually, I'll share it on Facebook. I'll just share a screenshot of what it looks like.
Another question I get a lot of the time is, does caffeine dehydrate you? And if you are kind of habituated to caffeine, it's very unlikely that you're going to be dehydrated at all. And even if so, the amount of caffeine that you're consuming, if you're not habituated, slim to none. And telling people like to stop drinking coffee, they've done studies that show that then they don't actually replace that with another beverage. They just kind of eliminate it. So then they end up consuming less liquid, less fluid at the end of the day, which then dehydrates them. So it's not particularly something that you have to worry about. And even if there was a small, Andrew Huberman did a thing about caffeine, and he was saying even if there was a small sodium loss, that we have electrolytes in our bottles, and there's salt in gels, there's sodium in different products that we take, so that's replaced anyway. So you really don't have to be worried about dehydration from caffeine consumption.
And the other thing, caffeine will not. In terms of bone absorption, I think it's only if it's super high dosages, isn't it, Elizabeth? There's something about that.
Yeah, but doses that
are not feasible. Yeah.
Like and again, I think that wasn't human testing, that was animal testing, because they couldn't give humans that concentrated of a caffeine dose without other negative effects.
Yeah.
So yeah, and it's not something to worry about.
Yeah.
All right, let's open it up to questions from the group if you guys have some. I guess I can keep sharing my screen for now. Anyone wants to jump in?
Does everyone drink, or does everyone consume caffeine? Has everyone done it in a race scenario or training scenario at this point in time?
Yeah, I used to have, when I was using Power Bar out on the bike and on the run, I was alternating between a caffeinated gel and a non-caffeinated gel every 30 minutes. I've since moved over to the Never Second and just picked up I tried their espresso caffeinated gel and it was absolutely horrible. I just picked up their cola one from Coach Lenski. So I'm kind of excited to try that this weekend. But I haven't been using caffeinated gels in my long rides recently. So, but yeah, outside of that, I mean, I do have quite a few cups of coffee in the morning.
Yeah. And have you used the no dose pill? Have you ever tried that?
Nope. I'm not a huge pill popper unless it's vitamins.
Yeah, which I'd probably say the efficacy of caffeine is probably much better than vitamins. So, yeah, look, I would certainly encourage you, Jason. I know sometimes it is a little bit of arm twisting, and certainly I'm not going to get you to do something that you wouldn't want to do. But as pointed out, what you pointed out is a lot of the caffeinated gels taste terrible. Because they put these coffee flavors in and cola flavors. So that again is a personal thing, but I would either take a 200 milligram pill.
Okay.
and then wash it down, or put that into a gel that you actually enjoy the flavor of, and then just consume it that way. But I would certainly, as Elizabeth has said, is like based on this screen, is like refine the process, work out when you need to take it, given that we will recommend, as I said, in 70.3, around 40 to 60 minutes into the ride. That's when you want to sort of also, if you've got a 3-hour ride or something like that, then you want to be trying to think about that.
Yeah, and given that we're just a few weeks away from Kona, it's probably not even worth testing. I'm not entirely sure.
Oh yeah, definitely is. Yeah,
is there?
Look,
okay.
Yeah, you're a habitual caffeine drinker. Like I would say 100% there's like reason this, if you don't use, well, again, I'm just going to get on my high horse here. If you're not using caffeine at Kona, I would sort of be like, why not? Like when it's a legal supplement that has been shown to improve performance, why would you not use it?
Yeah, and that was my other thought, was why not? You know, it's, you know, well, why not use it? At least throw it in there and see what it does. It can't hurt. So.
Well, it can hurt. Don't just throw it in at Kona. Don't just throw it in at Kona. Throw it in training. Make sure you're very, very comfortable with it. That you know, right, when I take it here, as Elizabeth's pointing out, when I take it at 40 minutes, I feel like an absolute bull for the next 2 hours on that. And then again, if you could do it with a brick, and then again, or on a long run session, how do you feel when you take that 200 milligrams of caffeine when you're running, and what is the impact of that on running performance? Because you've got to remember your heart rate will go up. So one thing to really just pay attention to and be mindful of is your heart rate will increase when you take caffeine on board. So for any of those athletes out there who suddenly get really, they're like, you know, looking at all their data on their bike or on their wrist and whatnot as they're running or riding, don't be too alarmed when your heart rate starts to go up, because you've then got to look at just, you know, look at the other metrics. How are you actually feeling? How's your breathing? How's your rate of perceived exertion? How's your wattage? How is your heart rate? So on. How's your speed? And then look at how that impacts you, because that is, you know, that's what you want to be practicing. I think too often athletes will go, oh, this sounds amazing. They'll read about the latest supplement and then they'll start taking it without practicing it and then try it on race day. And, you know, certainly at Kona, where it's, you know, you're building up to this for so long, I'd hate for an athlete to think that caffeine is going to be good for them on race day, but having not practiced it.
All right.
Yeah.
So our challenge for September, a little late getting this started, but I think it makes for the consistency component. We are seeing who can log their daily food intake into the app every day for the next 15 days, the 15th through the 30th. You can either obviously enter it in manually by selecting from the recipes in the app. You can use MyFitnessPal, Lose It, etc. Then share a screenshot. So take like this on the left. If you've logged in, you know, your meals, and then share it on Instagram. If you're not on Instagram, you can post it in the Facebook group, or you can send it to us and we can post it on Instagram. Can enter as much as you want. You just have to make sure to tag us so we see it. And then one-on-one consultation with Scott or myself for the end of September. So basically be consistent for 15 days, logging your food in, which a lot of you, especially on this call, do already. So might be the easiest challenge we have yet, at least for this specific cohort of people.
Yeah, I think so.
All right. So other caffeine questions and or any burning questions you have while you've got Scott and I on here?
Yeah, I have a question. There were a lot of guidelines and calculations on, I think there was like milligrams of caffeine per body weight. Can you guys share like a cheat sheet or something to provide that guidance to do testing? Because I do take caffeine specifically before races. I drink coffee every day, but I'll do a 200 milligram caffeine drink like as I head over to the swim before a race. It works phenomenally well, but that was simply because 200 milligrams is what came in the little drink packet. So I don't know, it just seems like a lot of caffeine, so I'll try it. I'd love to get a little bit more experimental and scientific, but have a good place to start rather than just guessing.
Okay.
I think, honestly, Amy, whilst all the calculations are really interesting, what we're trying to get through is that 100 milligrams is fairly ineffective compared to 200 milligrams. Now, you could potentially go above 200 milligrams in a bolus. So if you think, okay, so think 3 milligrams per kilo of body weight. So without going into what your body weight is, divide your weight in pounds by 2.2, divide it roughly by 2, and then times that by 3.
Yep.
So that gives you, where does that sit roughly? Like it's probably a little bit around 200.
Yeah, about 180.
So there you go. Like, so 200 is there or thereabouts. Like as long as you're not going over 9 milligrams per kilogram of body weight. But I would say somewhere between 3 and 6 is probably, or 3 and 5 is probably fairly safe. So all you need to know is that a 200 milligram hit of caffeine should be effective for 95% of individuals to give them a significant improvement in rate of perceived exertion, time to exhaustion, so on and so on. Now, could you take more than 200 milligrams as a bolus? Yes, you could. But if you're also going to take multiple sources, like multiple amounts of 200 milligrams, then you've got to factor that in, because what we often recommend on a 70.3 is you're taking 200 milligrams on the bike and then another 200 milligrams on the run. And same in an Ironman, you may actually take caffeine potentially 3 times, which could be 600 milligrams over the course of that, somewhere between 9 and 16 hours. In a 70.3, you could be taking 400 milligrams over 4.5 to 6.5 hours. So I think as a very practical just recommendation would be, you're going to be consuming somewhere between 100 milligrams and 200 milligrams, depending on testing and your individual variation. I wouldn't recommend, generally speaking, taking more than 200 milligrams at a single time. Would you agree with that, Elizabeth?
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Like, you can take one. I mean, go and drink one of those monster drinks if you want to have a big hit of caffeine. And you'll know what, you'll know what 400 milligrams of caffeine feels like. You won't sleep for days. So yeah, look, all the calculations and the numbers there are really interesting in terms of being really precise. But I think it's like, the reality is 200 milligrams is going to be an effective dose for you. Maybe going a little bit above it could be good, but I wouldn't necessarily suggest it.
But it's something you can test, like Scott said. It's you've got time test. If 200 had you feeling great, but maybe only was lasted for a short time, would 300 help or 250 help? Like, again, playing around with it to figure out kind of dosage and timing for you might be beneficial.
And I think the other thing just to consider is, you take 200 milligrams and you feel really good and you're like, oh, I could take some more. Just remember that peak values of caffeine, if it's in a capsule form, could take up to 2 hours before it hits that. So if you then go and take another 200 milligrams on top, you could feel pretty average pretty quickly. Like, again, if I take on too much caffeine, I get really jittery, really a bit anxious, all those sorts of things, and just feel really off. So, just take that into consideration as well. And the other thing we haven't mentioned here, if you take too much caffeine, you can kill yourself, just as throwing it out there. Okay. So people have died from taking in too much caffeine. Like, there was someone, who was it recently? There was a printing mistake on a supplement, and it was, instead of 200 milligrams, it recommended take in 2000 milligrams. And so the individual was taking in 2 grams of caffeine, and they ended up in a hospital. I think one of them died and another one didn't. It was in Australia. So yeah, caffeine is a very like powerful stimulant. So yeah, I wouldn't go too high. In other words, we don't want anyone having that sort of effect.
And Scott, I didn't look into this, so I'm not sure. Are there certain medications that affect caffeine metabolism and absorption? Like if someone's on a heart medicine or a statin, do you know, I mean, while we're giving health recommendations, is that something that they have to check with or asthma medication or whatever? Like, are there, I've just never.
Well, I think if you've got high blood pressure, it could be a consideration because obviously it is going to increase heart rate. So I would certainly, if you have any cardiac issues, if you have any underlying medical conditions and you are concerned that taking in caffeine in higher doses in sort of a pharmaceutical form could be potentially negative to your health, then talk to your doctor or talk to the prescribing consultant who manages your health to ensure that taking in caffeine is advisable. And I think that, that goes. If you've got any concerns or you are taking any medication, then certainly check with your healthcare provider.
And Jason, I just asked my friend Jonathan, who works at Inside Tracker. They do not test for caffeine metabolism in the genetic testing. So
okay, sounds good. Thank you.
But now we know.
Yeah, now we know.
Told him add it to the list. He's like, that's a good idea. Thanks, E. So maybe by next year, they're pretty responsive. They just got that big grant, so maybe they will add it. Who knows?
Oh, that would be cool if they did.
Yeah. They said there are people who would want it, especially
Yeah.
athletes, right? Like that's a very practical test to want to get.
Louise, you use it, don't you? Louise, you're using caffeine, and you're obviously, you're in a very hot environment as well. So, how do you find caffeine affects you?
I drink quite a lot of coffee and Coke Zero. So I have quite a lot of caffeine on a daily basis. I was going to ask a question actually. So I normally take, or on my best race, when it all went to plan, I had a 200 milligram tablet about an hour before I started. But then I've never taken additional tablets. Well, I've only done 3 Ironman. I haven't taken any other tablets during the race. I've just done caffeine gels on the run and drunk Coke on the run. So I guess I've then I've had a hit at the start and then I guess drip fed it on the run. But my coach had said to me at the time, kind of keep the caffeine for the second half of the run to get the hit. And once you start taking it, don't stop taking it because then you kind of fall off a cliff. But so I didn't know whether I don't have any given the half-life, I don't have any long enough training sessions left now between now and Kona to kind of take a tablet before and then one mid-session to see how it goes. But on the basis that, so on the run, I take the endurance tap gels with caffeine in them.
Yeah. It's only 50 milligrams of caffeine.
But there's not a lot. I've also had I haven't taken any recent, the SIS espresso gels, which I quite like, which have a lot more in them. But so I wasn't really sure what to do, whether just to stick with what I've done before and know it worked, or whether to introduce a tablet. And I guess, when do you recommend doing that? So at some point during the bike, but then, so my first one was Arizona and everything, where I just had one of those. It was the first one I went in with no expectations and I just had the best race I've ever had.
Yeah.
And then since then I've had GI issues. So I don't know whether, do I increase the likelihood if I suddenly whack in 200 milligrams of caffeine in one hit mid-race, am I going to increase the chance of GI issues?
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those ones. Look, your 100 milligrams of caffeine pre-race is fine. Like, I know a lot of athletes do that. And I had an athlete I think I documented that in the Facebook group, what Scott McIntyre did on the weekend at Santa Cruz and how he did it. I mean, how long have you got any long bike rides coming up between now and then? Like 2 hours even?
I haven't. So I've got a 2-hour easy ride on Saturday. I don't know what my program is for the week after that, but I've got some travel, so it'd probably be just shorter sessions with a bit of intensity and to keep me ticking over.
I mean, knowing that you've taken a caffeine pill before, knowing that you're a habitual drinker, I can't imagine there'll be that many issues, but I'd certainly want you to take it during a few training sessions to make sure you feel comfortable with it. So that's what I would suggest. But if you're nervous about it or you're unsure and you've got a huge race, then just leave it out at this point in time.
But she could try this in their 2-hour ride, don't have me before, then maybe at a 15 half-hour in.
I just take it at the start of the ride, nearly. I would just take it at the start of the ride. And then knowing that the half-life, knowing that peak absorption is going to come in at around, between an hour and 2 hours, you'll know what it feels like. But obviously the intensity of that ride is going to be lower than what you'd be pushing in a race scenario. So there are those sort of, considerations. And if you were going to use it on the run, imagine even if you've got a 60-minute run at race pace, if you've got anything like that, then you could take it maybe 20 minutes. If you imagine take it 20 or 30 minutes before that run, and then go and do the run, it would sort of be there or thereabouts. You'd feel comfortable. You know how you feel with it. So yeah, as I said to Jason, practice it a couple of times. If it doesn't work well in training, then you just leave it out. It's not going to be one of those supplements where it's going to stay in your system and cause you all sorts of issues down the line. So I would, do that.
Okay, cool. Thanks.
Cool.
Good question.
Yeah, good question. Excellent. Okay. Thank you, everyone. Hope it gave you a little bit of insight into caffeine. Thank you, Elizabeth, for that. It's always good just to review things like this and just have a look at what the research shows and how to, the most important thing is the practical element of it. Amy, to your questions, Louise and Amy, and to Karen, and Jay, actually all of you, it's how do you do it practically and how do you implement it into training so that your race actually works out really well? So, that's always the take-home message from this, is how do you implement something practically and what are the implications of that?
Maybe let us know if you try it. I'm actually curious now if you guys try it before Kona, how you felt, and it's well, because now I'm invested. Now I want to know what you guys use.
And do recommend. I tend to recommend No Dose just because it's a brand that. The problem is none of them are NSF or Informed Sport. Classified. That's probably one of the issues. If you can maybe your doctor can get you a prescription caffeine pill as well. It could be something to consider.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks for taking the time, tuning in, and for turning your screens on. It's nice to see faces.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
All right. Bye, guys.
Bye.
See ya.